Imagine you're lying in bed, eyes closed, trying desperately to fall asleep. You think to yourself, "Don't think about how awake I feel." But then, with cruel persistence, that very thought loops back into your mind. The more you try not to think about being awake, the more alert you feel. This strange, counterintuitive effect is not just a personal quirk. It's a well-documented psychological mechanism known as the ironic process theory. Proposed by the social psychologist Daniel Wegner in the late 20th century, the ironic process theory describes a curious flaw in human cognition. When we actively try to suppress a thought, especially under stress or distraction, our mind tends to return to it with even greater intensity. It's the mental equivalent of telling someone, "Whatever you do, don't think of a white bear." Instantly, a white bear appears, uninvited, in their mental landscape. Wegner's own experiments confirm this. Participants instructed to avoid thinking of a white bear while talking were found to mention it more often than those given no such instruction. The brain, it seems, doesn't simply delete thoughts on command. Instead, it sets up a dual process, a conscious effort to suppress the unwanted thought, and an unconscious process that scans for the very thought we're trying to avoid, ironically, to make sure we're not thinking about it. But this isn't merely a psychological curiosity. The implications of the ironic process theory reach into the most intimate corners of our lives: anxiety, insomnia, addiction, compulsions, and even moral guilt. A recovering alcoholic may repeat, "Don't think about drinking," only to find the thought of alcohol growing more vivid. A person struggling with intrusive thoughts may try to push them away, and yet, like shadows cast by the effort of suppression itself, they return more powerfully. Why does this happen? Wegner theorized that thought suppression relies on two systems. First, the intentional operating process, which consciously searches for distractions or acceptable thoughts. Second, the ironic monitoring process, which subconsciously checks whether the forbidden thought is occurring. The paradox is this: the very act of monitoring for the unwanted thought requires that it remain mentally accessible. So, under cognitive load, when we are tired, stressed, or emotionally strained, the intentional process weakens and the ironic one prevails. The result: the thought returns, uninvited, like a mental reflex. This mechanism challenges our deeply held belief in the sovereignty of the will. We like to think of the mind as a domain we control, a landscape where attention obeys intention. But the ironic process theory suggests that the act of trying not to think something might, in fact, be a recipe for its persistence. Philosophers have long hinted at this internal contradiction. The Stoics warned against obsession with virtue for fear that it becomes vanity. Freud, in his psychoanalytic framework, described how repressed desires often re-emerge in disguised forms: dreams, slips of the tongue, or neurotic behavior. Even the Buddhist notion of non-attachment suggests that striving too hard to quiet the mind is, in itself, a kind of clinging. Consider how this plays out in modern society. The rise of mindfulness and meditation is often a reaction to the chronic overactivity of the modern mind. But even in these practices, novices often report frustration. "I can't stop thinking." They try harder, only to find their thoughts spinning faster. Ironically, the solution is often to do nothing, to observe without judgment, without force. Let the thought arise, let it pass. In acceptance lies the end of struggle. This insight reveals something profound about human nature. We are not machines with delete buttons. The mind is not an obedient servant, but a sensitive, dynamic system that often rebels against coercion. The ironic process theory reminds us that the harder we try to control our thoughts, the less control we may actually have. And so, perhaps the path to mental peace is not through forceful suppression, but through a quiet, patient curiosity. Not, "Don't think this," but, "What is this thought trying to say?" In a world that often demands we be in control, this may be the most paradoxical advice of all. Sometimes, to think less, we must try less. Have you ever noticed how the more we push something away, the closer it gets? A child watches the tide roll in, waves collapsing gently onto the shore, only to retreat moments later. There's no fear in the child's eyes, only wonder. The water comes, the water goes. It is only with time, with the gradual unveiling of experience, that the child will come to understand. Everything that begins toward its end. Every arrival is already on the road to departure. Every breath, from the first wail in the delivery room is a step toward the last. This quiet truth sits at the heart of the human condition. To begin is to begin toward death. Philosophers have long circled this thought, hesitant but unable to turn away. Martin Heidegger, perhaps the most direct among them, described human existence as sein zum Tode, being toward death. For Heidegger, death is not merely an event that happens at the end, but a fundamental part of what it means to be. We do not live and then die. We live with death from the very beginning. The awareness, whether clear or faint, that our time is finite, shapes every choice we make, every love we risk, every lie we tell or truth we speak. Yet most of us live as if we were exceptions. We surround ourselves with noise and movement to keep this realization at bay. We delay, we distract, we deny. Death becomes something that happens to others, in distant hospitals or tragic news headlines. We push it to the edges of thought, hoping that by not naming it, we can postpone its arrival. But this avoidance doesn't eliminate the presence of death. It merely blinds us to the full meaning of life. Because if death were not certain, if we could live forever, would anything really matter? Would we hurry to say, "I love you," or hesitate to say, "I'm sorry"? Would we strive to create beauty, or just wait for another century, another chance? Our mortality is not just a boundary. It is the frame that gives life its shape. It is the silence that makes the music possible. The ancient Stoics, from Epictetus to Marcus Aurelius, encouraged daily reflection on death, not as morbid obsession, but as a guide to wisdom. Memento mori, they said. Remember that you must die. In that remembering, one might live more fully. The Japanese concept of mono no aware, the gentle sadness of things, also captures this. The fleeting nature of existence is precisely what gives it poignancy. A cherry blossom is beautiful not despite its short bloom, but because of it. Science, too, offers its own reflections. From the moment of conception, biological processes are already set in motion for their own decline. Cells divide, grow, repair, and eventually falter. Entropy, the great equalizer, ensures that all ordered systems will dissolve into disorder. This is not a failure of nature, but its rhythm. Stars are born, shine, and collapse. Galaxies drift, collide, and fade. In this, we are not an exception, but a continuation. A leaf falling in autumn is not a tragedy. It is a returning. And yet to know this is not necessarily to despair. In fact, it can be the beginning of something deeper, presence. When we accept that every beginning carries within it the seed of its end, we are invited into a different relationship with time. We begin to pay attention. The conversation with a loved one is no longer routine. It might be the last. The sunrise is not just another day. It is this day, and no other. Even pain is transformed. It becomes a marker of how deeply we have lived, how much we have dared to care. The paradox is that by facing death, not as a distant abstraction but as a part of our being, we may, at last, begin to live authentically, to strip away pretense, to choose what matters, to say yes to life, not in denial of death, but in defiance of numbness. There is no need to rush to the end, nor to flee from it. The point is not how long we live, but how honestly. And honesty begins by acknowledging the path we are on, from the first breath to the last, from beginning toward death. We are waves. We rise, we crest, and we return. But while we are here, brief and luminous, we are the ocean, remembering itself. There is a silence in the early hours of the morning, just before the world awakens, when the mind wanders beyond the limits of what is seen or said. It is in this silence that a question often emerges. Soft, persistent, almost unreasonable. Where did I come from? Not biologically, not historically, but fundamentally. Why am I here at all? Behind that question stands an ancient metaphysical riddle, the idea of the causa sui, that which causes itself. At first glance, the concept seems absurd. In our everyday understanding, everything comes from something. A seed comes from a tree, which comes from another seed. A thought arises from experience. A house is built from materials that existed before it. To say that something could be its own cause, that it could generate itself from nothing, seems to violate the basic logic of causality. It is like asking how a book could write itself without an author, or how a flame could ignite without fuel. And yet, the idea of causa sui has persisted for centuries, haunting the edges of theology, philosophy, and psychology. In theology, it has been used to describe God, the necessary being who owes existence to nothing but itself. In this view, God is not a created entity, but the uncaused cause, the origin of all that is. Spinoza, in particular, embraced this notion. For him, God and nature were one and the same, a self-causing, infinite substance whose existence was not contingent but essential. To Spinoza, causa sui was not a contradiction. It was the only logical way to ground existence itself. But the idea does not belong only to the divine. In a different register, existentialists and psychoanalysts have adapted causa sui to speak about human striving. For thinkers like Ernest Becker and Otto Rank, the human being, stripped of divine guarantees, becomes a creature obsessed with self-creation. Aware of its mortality, yet desperate for meaning, the individual tries to become self-made, a being who authors its own purpose, who wills itself into significance. Becker, in The Denial of Death, argues that modern man is driven by a kind of immortality project, the attempt to become causa sui, to escape death by creating a legacy that endures beyond the body. Whether through art, achievement, empire, or children, we seek to become our own origin, to matter, not just momentarily, but absolutely. It is a noble impulse, but also a tragic one. For in truth, we are not self-caused. We are thrown into the world, as Heidegger put it, into a condition we did not choose, with bodies we did not design, and a finitude we cannot escape. And still, we rebel. We build identities, philosophies, nations. We strive to give ourselves meaning in a universe that offers none by default. This striving is, in a sense, a creative act, a refusal to be nothing. And yet it is also marked by anxiety, because to create oneself fully is to stand alone, without external justification. It is to take the terrifying risk of being the source of one's own value. In psychological terms, this is the tension between dependence and autonomy. The child first sees the parent as the source of safety, meaning, and love, but adulthood demands a separation, a slow, painful movement toward becoming one's own authority. The mature self is one that, while acknowledging its origins, must nevertheless affirm itself from within. This is not literal self-causation, but something existentially close. The act of saying, I am because I choose to be. But how far can this go? Can a person truly be self-made, or are we always echoes of what came before? Language, culture, memory, all precede us. Even our acts of rebellion are shaped by the very structures we resist. Perhaps then, causa sui is not a state to be achieved, but an asymptotic ideal, something we approach but never fully become, a myth, but a necessary one. Because to live without origin is unbearable, and to live entirely dependent is equally crushing. The myth of self-causation gives us a space to move, a way to hold ourselves responsible without being paralyzed by the past. So, what do we make of causa sui? It is not a fact, but a metaphor, not a logical proposition, but a cry of the soul. Let me be the author of my life. In a world where every cause has another behind it, we seek a point of origin that is ours alone. This is not science. It is yearning. We are not gods, and yet we reach for self-creation. We are born without asking, but we can choose how to respond. That response, the daily act of becoming, is perhaps the closest we come to being causa sui, not because we made ourselves from nothing, but because we refuse to be nothing more than what made us. You're sitting across from someone, perhaps a friend, a stranger, a lover. They smile. You smile back. They speak, and you understand the words. You even think you know what they feel. But how do you know they feel anything at all? This is not a question of empathy, but of existence. Not whether others hurt or rejoice or lie, but whether they are conscious in the first place. This is the ancient and persistent philosophical dilemma known as the problem of other minds. It seems absurd at first. Of course, other people are conscious. They laugh when tickled, cry at funerals, and protest when harmed. But these are behaviors. What we observe are bodies moving, mouths forming words, tears falling from eyes. We infer from these signals that there is a mind behind them, a rich, subjective world like our own. Yet no amount of observation, no scan or study, allows us to access that inner world directly. We know it only by analogy. I do these things, and I have a mind, so they must too. But here lies the heart of the problem. The only consciousness we ever directly experience is our own. Every other mind is hidden behind a veil, permanently inaccessible. I can watch your face, hear your words, study your brain activity, but I cannot feel your fear, or your hunger, or your love. Your subjectivity is, for me, a hypothesis. This uncertainty disturbed thinkers like Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein, who struggled with the epistemological implications. How can we justify our belief in other minds when we cannot verify them? How do we know that others aren't philosophical zombies, beings who behave exactly like conscious people, but who have no inner experience at all? Wittgenstein offered a subtle answer. In his philosophical investigations, he argued that language is inherently social. To speak meaningfully about sensations like pain or joy requires a shared framework of expression. When someone says, "I'm in pain," we don't ask for proof. We respond, because we've been shaped by a form of life where such expressions carry meaning. Consciousness, in this view, is not a private object hidden inside a skull, but something revealed in how we live and relate. And yet, the doubt lingers. René Descartes, in his famous Meditations, could doubt everything, his senses, his memories, even the external world, but not the existence of his own thinking. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But he could not extend that certainty to others. They remained shadows, as uncertain as dreams. This solipsistic corner is the dark side of self-awareness. If my own mind is the only thing I know directly, then everything else is conjecture. In the modern era, neuroscience has deepened the mystery. We can now map brain states, identify neural correlates of consciousness, and track how specific areas light up during thought or emotion. But even this remains third-person data. No scan can tell us what it's like to be another person. The philosopher Thomas Nagel made this point with his famous essay, "What is it like to be a bat?" He argued that no matter how much we learn about a bat's biology, we can never know what it's like to experience the world through echolocation. There is an irreducible subjectivity that resists measurement. The problem is not limited to philosophy. It affects how we treat others. When we dehumanize, we often begin by denying or ignoring the inner lives of others. If someone is seen as less than fully conscious, less capable of suffering or reflection, they become easier to harm, ignore, or exploit. In this way, the problem of other minds is not just abstract. It underlies ethical and political failures. And yet, most of the time, we choose trust over doubt. We act as if other people are conscious. We love them, mourn them, listen to their stories. We feel connected, even without certainty. This, perhaps, is a form of faith. Not religious faith, but existential trust. We accept that the world is full of other minds, each with its own pains, hopes, memories, and mysteries. We believe not because we can prove, but because without that belief, life becomes unbearable. There's a quiet humility in this stance. We recognize that every face we pass might hold an inner universe as complex and vivid as our own. That behind the eyes of the cashier, the student, the parent, the prisoner, there is a mind we will never fully know. The paradox is that what makes others unknowable also makes them worthy of reverence. They are not things to be understood completely, but beings to be met with respect, curiosity, and care. And so we live, surrounded by a world of hidden minds, each one burning with thoughts we'll never think, feelings we'll never feel. In the end, perhaps that's what makes the human condition both lonely and beautiful. To be one consciousness among many, reaching out across the great silence, hoping someone reaches back. You wake up. For a moment you feel like yourself, tired, maybe hopeful, maybe numb. But what exactly is this self you wake up as? Is it a solid central entity, a soul, a core that stays the same from childhood to old age? Or is it something else entirely, something more elusive, fragile, and fluid? The bundle theory of the self, most famously articulated by the Scottish philosopher David Hume in the 18th century, suggests something radical. There is no self in the way we commonly imagine, no unified I underneath our thoughts and feelings. Instead, what we call the self is simply a bundle, a collection of sensations, memories, perceptions, and experiences, loosely tied together by habit and narrative. According to Hume, when we introspect, when we look inward in search of our essential me, we never find anything fixed. We find thoughts, emotions, desires, images, but never a stable self that contains them. He writes, "When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception." In other words, the self is not an object behind experience, It is the flow of experience itself. This idea is unsettling to many because it undermines one of the most cherished intuitions we have, that we are a continuous being, a persistent I, that owns our body and history. But under the lens of bundle theory, this continuity is an illusion, a psychological construction formed by the mind's need for order and coherence. Consider how our identities shift depending on mood, context, or memory. You are not the same self in grief as you are in joy, nor the same at work as you are in solitude. The thoughts you had 5 years ago might now seem foreign, even absurd, yet we often string these changes together into a single story. I have grown, I have changed, I am still me. But this narrative, Hume suggests, is just that, a narrative, not a substance. The mind does not observe a stable self, it invents one. Modern psychology echoes this view. The theory of the modular mind, for instance, suggests that the brain is composed of semi-independent systems, each with its own goals, responses, and memories. The self that emerges is not a captain at the helm, but more like a shifting coalition of subpersonalities. Neuroscience shows that damage to certain parts of the brain can drastically alter personality, preference, even the sense of agency, raising the question, if the self can be changed so easily, was it ever truly stable? Buddhist philosophy anticipated this insight centuries before Hume. The doctrine of anatta, non-self, teaches that what we think of as I is a temporary aggregation of 5 skandhas: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Clinging to the illusion of a permanent self, the Buddha taught, is the root of suffering. Freedom lies not in securing the self, but in letting go of it. Yet despite its illusory nature, the sense of self has power. It organizes memory, motivates action, and structures society. Legal systems, economies, even love depend on the presumption of a person who endures through time. Perhaps the self, like money or language, is a useful fiction, real not because it's inherent, but because we believe in it together. Still, the fragility of this fiction can be a source of anxiety. If there is no true me, then who suffers, who chooses, who is responsible? The bundle theory invites us to rethink agency, not as the product of a fixed self, but as something that arises from patterns, habits, and relationships. We are not static entities making decisions from the outside, but dynamic systems responding from within. And maybe, just maybe, there is a strange liberation in this. If the self is not a prison of permanence, then we are not bound to our past mistakes or identities. If we are a bundle, then we can be rebundled, not in denial of what we were, but in honest recognition that what we are is never finished. So the next time you say, "This is just who I am," pause. Ask yourself, who is speaking? Which thoughts are present? Which memories are active? And might a different version of you, just as real, just as valid, emerge tomorrow? The self, in the end, may not be a thing to be found. It may be a story we tell in passing, a constellation we trace in the sky of experience, changing, flickering, endlessly rewritten, and perhaps that too is a kind of truth worth living. A man stands at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the endless ocean. The wind moves through him like a whisper, and for a moment he feels small, so small that he can almost vanish into the sky. Beneath that moment of stillness, something ancient stirs, a pulse of fear, not of falling, but of being, and of someday not being. This fear, this awareness of death, is not just a shadow on the edges of human life. According to terror management theory, TMT, it is the foundational force that shapes human culture, belief, and behavior. We do not just fear death, we build civilizations to deny it. Terror management theory, developed by social psychologists Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pyszczynski in the 1980s, is grounded in the insights of cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, Becker argued that human beings, unlike other animals, live with the terrifying knowledge of their own mortality. We know that we will die. We don't know when or how. And this knowledge, if left unbuffered, would be psychologically paralyzing. To manage this existential terror, we construct meaning systems, worldviews that give life a sense of order, purpose, and permanence. These worldviews, whether religious, national, ideological, or personal, offer a sense of symbolic immortality. They promise that even if our bodies perish, we belong to something greater, something enduring. Consider religion. Nearly every tradition includes beliefs about life beyond death, heaven, reincarnation, ancestral spirits. But even secular ideologies serve the same function. Nations endure, art lives on, our children carry our names. These are not just comforting ideas. They are defense mechanisms against the anxiety of annihilation. TMT suggests that much of what we do, pursue status, defend our beliefs, condemn outsiders, is an unconscious effort to reinforce the structures that protect us from the abyss. When reminded of death, a condition called mortality salience, people tend to cling more tightly to their cultural values, become more nationalistic, more religious, more punitive toward those who threaten their worldview. In experimental studies, even a subtle reminder of death, passing a funeral home, answering questions about mortality, can influence everything from voting behavior to consumer choices. This has profound implications. If our need to deny death drives aggression, prejudice, and conformity, then many societal conflicts may be fueled not by ideology alone, but by unspoken death anxiety. Wars, persecutions, even everyday cruelty may stem from the fear that our way of life, our buffer against nothingness, is under threat. But there is another side to this. The same fear that leads to violence can also inspire compassion, creativity, and courage. If we know we are temporary, we may strive to leave something meaningful behind. We write books, raise children, plant trees, not just for others, but to affirm that we mattered, that something of us will continue. Ernest Becker called this the heroic impulse, the drive to transcend death by becoming part of something eternal. The problem, he warned, is that if everyone is trying to be a hero within their own symbolic system, and those systems collide, conflict becomes inevitable. Your version of immortality may be incompatible with mine. So what do we do with this knowledge? Terror management. Theory does not offer easy answers, but it suggests that confronting mortality directly, rather than denying it, may be the first step toward living more freely. When we acknowledge that our beliefs are shields, not certainties, we might hold them more lightly. When we see that others are building their own shelters against the storm, we might judge them less harshly. And when we remember that we will die, we may finally ask what it means to live, not just safely, but deeply. There is an old saying, you have two lives. The second begins when you realize you have only one. Terror management theory tells us why that realization is so hard, and why it is also perhaps our greatest chance at becoming truly human. Because in the face of death, we build meaning, and in building meaning, we become more than biology. We become the stories we tell, the love we give, the traces we leave, not immortal, but not forgotten. The fire crackles beneath the altar. A priest raises a blade. An animal, trembling, breathing, alive, is laid down, and a moment later, it is not. The smoke rises heavenward. Prayers are spoken. The people watch. This, for millennia, was how humanity negotiated with the divine. Animal sacrifice has been practiced across cultures and religions, from the ancient Israelites, Greeks, and Aztecs, to the Vedic rituals of India and the early Islamic world. But when viewed through the lens of theodicy, the attempt to reconcile the existence of evil and suffering with a benevolent, omnipotent God, it becomes more than a ritual. It becomes a question, a wound, a paradox. Why must something innocent suffer for the sake of something guilty? At its core, theodicy grapples with a troubling triad. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and good, then why does evil exist? Why pain? Why death? Why injustice? In response, many religious systems propose that suffering has meaning, that it purifies, tests, redeems. But this raises another question. Why should that meaning be carried by another creature? Why should an animal, unknowing and powerless, bear the weight of human failure? In many traditions, animal sacrifice operates as substitution. The creature becomes a stand-in for human sin or imperfection. Its death is meant to appease divine wrath, to restore balance, to cleanse the community. In the Hebrew Bible, the ritual of the scapegoat is especially striking. One goat is sacrificed, the other is symbolically burdened with the sins of the people and sent into the wilderness. It is an image of transference, guilt displaced, carried away. But theodicy complicates this. If justice is a divine attribute, what kind of justice demands the death of the blameless? And if mercy is also divine, what kind of mercy accepts a proxy rather than forgiving directly? Some theologians argue that sacrifice is not about divine need, but about human need, a dramatization of repentance, a visible gesture of remorse. The costliness of taking a life reflects the seriousness of moral failure. In this reading, God does not require the blood, the people do. The ritual becomes a mirror, forcing them to confront their own capacity for violence, for disobedience, for dependency on the created world. But this explanation has its limits. The animal does not choose to participate. It does not understand the ritual, the guilt, or the promise of redemption. Its suffering is imposed without consent. If we are troubled by human suffering in the face of divine justice, how much more perplexing is non-human suffering? Suffering without moral agency, without sin, without voice. This is where the question of animal suffering in theodicy becomes acute. Thinkers like Dostoevsky and C.S. Lewis have touched on this, wondering aloud how a good God can allow animals to experience pain at all. Unlike humans, they cannot be morally educated by it. They do not philosophize their anguish. Their pain is pure, immediate, unmitigated. So why do they suffer? And worse, why are they made to suffer in rituals meant to justify human failure? Some mystics and theologians have tried to answer with metaphors of cosmic unity. The animal, they suggest, is not merely a victim but a participant in a divine economy, one in which all creation bears the cost of human freedom. In this reading, the suffering of animals, like that of Christ in Christian theology, becomes a kind of grace-bearing, a sorrow that points beyond itself to some larger reconciliation. But this interpretation risks sanctifying violence. It can numb us to the creature's actual experience, replacing empathy with theology. At worst, it turns the victim into a symbol, erasing the real for the sake of the abstract. Today, as the ethics of animal suffering become more visible, in factory farming, in scientific research, in environmental collapse, the question returns with force. What does it mean to construct a religious system or a worldview that builds meaning on the back of a voiceless other? Can there be atonement that does not require substitution? Can justice include mercy not just for humans, but for all sentient life? Perhaps the persistence of animal sacrifice in the history of religion reveals something about us, not about God. It reveals our fear, our guilt, and our longing for redemption. But it also reveals our temptation to outsource pain, to displace the cost of our moral failures onto something else, something weaker, something that cannot say no. In the end, animal sacrifice in theodicy is not just a theological problem. It is a mirror. It asks whether our desire for purification has blinded us to the innocent lives we place on the altar, and whether, in trying to cleanse ourselves, we have only deepened the stain. And so we must ask, not only why does God allow suffering, but also, why do we? A man is condemned to push a rock up a hill. Every time he nears the summit, the rock slips from his grasp and rolls back down. He walks after it, without complaint, and begins again. There is no end, no reward, no relief, only repetition. This is the fate of Sisyphus, the tragic figure from Greek mythology who defied the gods and was sentenced to an eternity of futile labor. But in 1942, the French-Algerian philosopher Albert Camus looked into the face of this absurd punishment and saw something profound. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus transformed this ancient tale into a modern parable about existence, freedom, and the meaning, or meaninglessness, of life. Camus begins with a blunt declaration. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. If life is without ultimate purpose, if the universe offers no divine plan, no final redemption, no inherent reason, then why continue? Why not step out of the absurd game? This, Camus argues, is the central dilemma of human existence. We live with a deep craving for meaning, for coherence, for order. Yet the universe, in all its vast indifference, offers none. The result is the absurd, the clash between our desire for clarity and the cold silence of the world. Sisyphus, in this light, is not just a figure of myth. He is us. He represents the human condition, striving endlessly, hoping, failing, beginning again. We work, we love, we build, all while knowing that none of it will last. We die. Our achievements fade. The universe does not care. So, what then? Camus does not shy away from the darkness of this realization, but neither does he surrender to despair. Instead, he proposes an ethic of revolt, not against the absurd, but within it. To live in full awareness of the absurd without retreating into illusions or nihilism is to live defiantly. It is to say yes to life, even when life offers no reason. This is where Camus's insight reaches its most startling point. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. At first glance, this seems perverse. How can a man condemned to endless, pointless struggle be happy? But Camus is not being ironic. He means it. In the very act of recognizing the futility of his task, Sisyphus is freed from hope and from despair. He owns his fate. He becomes the master of his moment, even if he cannot escape it. The gods have punished him with repetition, but they have not broken his consciousness. In that space of awareness, he finds a strange kind of dignity. In choosing to go on, Sisyphus transforms punishment into practice. The rock becomes his companion, the hill, his domain. He is no longer crushed by the absurd. He carries it, eyes open, without illusion. Camus's vision is not a prescription for optimism. It is not about finding happiness in suffering. It is about the courage to live without appeal, to walk through life without clinging to false consolations. Religion, ideology, even progress can become ways of avoiding the absurd. Camus challenges us to resist that escape, to stay awake, to keep pushing. This perspective has echoes in Buddhism, in existentialism, even in the psychology of flow. There is a paradox here. In accepting the futility of a task, we may find presence. In letting go of the need for higher justification, we may become more deeply alive. The joy is not in the outcome, but in the rhythm, the movement, the act itself. Many have read the myth of Sisyphus as a bleak affirmation of meaninglessness, but Camus saw it differently. For him, the absurd was not an end. It was a beginning. The end of illusions opens the door to freedom. When we stop asking the universe for answers it cannot give, we begin to live on our own terms. And so, every day, we rise. We face the weight of routine, of effort, of uncertainty. We carry the rock, and in that burden there may be no redemption, but there can be lucidity. There can be will. There can be life. Sisyphus walks down the hill once more. His brow is damp, his arms ache, and yet he is not defeated. The absurd is still there, but so is he. A raindrop falls from the sky. It arcs through the air, drawn by gravity, shaped by the wind, bound by the laws of physics. If we knew all the conditions, its mass, the direction of the breeze, the humidity, the contours of the ground, we could, in theory, predict exactly where it would land. There would be no mystery, only inevitability. This is the vision at the heart of determinism, the idea that every event, every choice, every motion in the universe is the result of prior causes. Nothing happens randomly. Nothing escapes the chain of cause and effect. If we could rewind the universe to its beginning and let it unfold again, under precisely the same conditions, it would produce exactly the same outcomes, including you, including the thoughts you're having right now. In the 18th century, the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace took this idea to its logical extreme. He imagined a vast intelligence, later called Laplace's demon, that, if it knew the position and momentum of every particle in the universe at a given moment, could predict the future and retell the past with perfect precision. The world, in this view, is a clockwork, complex, yes, but ultimately knowable, mechanical, closed. But what does this mean for human beings? If determinism is true, then every decision we make, what we eat, who we love, what we believe, is not the result of free will, but of a long chain of influences: genetics, upbringing, culture, neurobiology, even the state of the universe before we were born. Your choice to read these words, for example, may feel free, but it might be just the surface of deeper currents. The structure of your brain, the shape of your habits, the trajectory of your life. This idea has long unsettled philosophers and theologians. It challenges the notion of moral responsibility. If I could not have done otherwise, am I guilty? Can we praise or blame people for actions that were, in a sense, inevitable? These questions are not abstract. They echo in courtrooms, in relationships, in the ways we judge ourselves and others. Some, like the philosopher Baron d'Holbach, embraced determinism fully. He saw humans as complex machines, moved not by spirit or will, but by forces we rarely understand. Others, like Immanuel Kant, insisted that freedom must exist in some domain, that morality demands it. Kant separated the phenomenal world, the world of causality, from the noumenal world, the realm of the self as moral agent. arguing that we must act as if we are free, even if we can't prove it. In modern times, the debate has only deepened. Neuroscience has revealed how decisions are preceded by brain activity, even before we become conscious of them. In one famous experiment, subjects were asked to press a button whenever they chose. Electrodes detected activity in their brains before they reported making the decision. This suggests that what we experience as conscious choice may be an afterthought, an illusion of agency layered on top of neurological processes already in motion. And yet, the story isn't so simple. Quantum physics, for example, introduces an element of uncertainty into the universe. At the smallest scales, particles behave probabilistically, not predictably. But this indeterminacy is not freedom in any meaningful sense. It is randomness, not will. A choice made by chance is not more free than one determined by cause. Some philosophers and scientists advocate for a position called compatibilism, the belief that free will and determinism can coexist. They argue that freedom does not require absolute independence from causality, but simply the ability to act according to one's desires and reasons, even if those are themselves caused. In this view, a person is free not because they are uncaused, but because they are themselves the cause, coherent, rational, and responsive to reasons. Others, like hard determinists, reject this reconciliation. They argue that if our sense of freedom is an illusion, we must have the courage to live without it, and to rethink justice, morality, and meaning accordingly. But even if determinism strips us of metaphysical freedom, it does not strip us of depth. It invites compassion. If people are shaped by causes beyond their control, then cruelty becomes absurd. Punishment shifts from retribution to protection or rehabilitation. And the more we understand the causes, the more we can change the conditions. Determinism does not mean fatalism. The future, though causally bound, is still open in practice, because we are part of the causal chain. So where does that leave us? Perhaps with a kind of humility, the realization that we are not sovereign islands, but intersections of forces, biology, history, physics, chance, perhaps with a sense of responsibility, not because we transcend causality, but because we are causality, thinking, feeling, and acting in a world where everything matters. The raindrop falls, not freely, but beautifully, as do we. A child cries in a dark room. Somewhere else a man screams in the silence of war. A woman lies awake at night, not from pain, but from the unbearable weight of meaninglessness. These are not rare scenes. They are scattered across the world, moments of suffering that often go unseen, unheard, unshared. And if there is a moral imperative that arises from such images, perhaps it is not to create happiness, but to prevent suffering. This is the central claim of negative utilitarianism, that the reduction of suffering, not the maximization of happiness, is the true ethical priority. Classic utilitarianism, rooted in the work of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, argues that the best action is the one that produces the greatest total happiness or pleasure for the greatest number. It treats joy and suffering as moral currencies, balancing one against the other in a global calculus. But to negative utilitarians, this arithmetic is flawed, not because it overvalues pleasure, but because it undervalues pain. The philosopher Karl Popper, though not a negative utilitarian in the strict sense, articulated its core intuition with a haunting clarity. There is no reason to put the increase of happiness before the decrease of suffering. The elimination of suffering is more urgent than the promotion of happiness. Now why? Because suffering, unlike pleasure, imposes a kind of moral urgency. To be in pain is not just to be low on a happiness scale. It is to cry out, make it stop. Pain demands. Pleasure invites. Negative utilitarianism takes this asymmetry seriously. It holds that preventing extreme suffering is a higher moral priority than creating extreme joy. Even if 1 million people are dancing in the sun, the unbearable suffering of one tortured soul outweighs the value of their happiness. It's not that joy doesn't matter, but that it should never come at the price of intense, involuntary harm. This has radical implications. In its most extreme form, negative utilitarianism has been used to argue that if existence inevitably entails suffering, then preventing existence, or even ending it, could be seen as a moral good. The philosopher David Benatar, for example, suggests in his antinatalist view that coming into existence is always a harm, because pain, once experienced, cannot be undone, while the absence of pleasure for someone who never existed is not a deprivation. Such ideas are disturbing, but they are meant to be. They ask us to take suffering seriously, not abstractly. They confront us with the horror that utilitarian optimism can sometimes gloss over, that behind the scenes of progress, millions still suffer in ways no amount of joy elsewhere can erase. Critics of negative utilitarianism argue that it leads to moral absurdities. If suffering is the only thing that matters, then wouldn't the logical conclusion be to eliminate all life, thereby eliminating all future suffering? This doomsday objection haunts the theory. Most negative utilitarians do not accept such drastic conclusions and instead argue for prioritizing the reduction of suffering, not at the cost of life itself, but as the compass that should guide all ethical action. They point to everyday choices. Should we invest in preventing rare diseases or in building luxury goods? Should we spend resources on enhancing the lives of the already comfortable or on alleviating the most desperate misery? If ethics is not just a matter of balance but of urgency, then suffering, especially severe, preventable suffering, must come first. In a world of limited time, money, and attention, this shift in focus can have real consequences. It reframes our ethical responsibilities, not as the pursuit of an abstract ideal, but as the rescue of the drowning. It does not ask us to be saints, only to see clearly that agony is not the moral equal of boredom, that a single scream may outweigh 1,000 smiles. Negative utilitarianism, then, is not a celebration of suffering. It is a refusal to look away from it. It is the ethical voice that says, if we must build a future, let it not be built on silence and pain, no matter how bright the architecture above it. Let us listen first to the worst off. Let us act not in pursuit of paradise, but in relief of hell. There may be no perfect world, but there can be fewer screams in the dark. And perhaps that, for now, is enough.